joystick. So, you're into playing retro games on original 8-bit consoles. That's admirable and well worth it, since the various idiosyncrasies of the original 8-bit and Nintendo Sega hardware have a lot of personality and really give it a unique flavor, especially if you're gonna go the extra step to play it on a CRT TV. However, it can get pretty damn expensive, and they can get pretty hard to come by for some games. But what if you could play games on original hardware without hunting down expensive cartridges? What if I were to tell you that there's a modern hardware platform that merges 1980s technology with modern FPGA tech that brings the best of both worlds? An authentic flavor of playing original game system hardware, but the flexibility to play almost every single 8-bit game. The Ukrainian FPGA hardware hacker company Krikzz had been putting out a product called Everdrives. It is an incredibly high-quality FPGA system for playing classic games on original systems, but with simulated cartridge hardware. But in order for me to explain just how Everdrives work and how awesome they are, first I need to explain how cartridges work. It all started in Japan in 1983. Nintendo and Sega both started their 8-bit home console lineage with the Nintendo Famicom and the Sega SG-1000. Their cartridges was a pretty simple affair. An Enron cartridge had ROM chips to load the game's data into the console's RAM. It was basic and it worked. However, as the 1980s progressed, game developers and game fans wanted more complex games on existing 8-bit hardware. The NES and the Famicom were limited by the paltry amount of RAM, which limited how complex video game graphics and level design could be. Game developers came up with a rather novel solution. What if the limited amount of RAM in consoles could be managed and quickly swapped out for whole other groups of data using memory banks? This could be done on the fly with a memory mapper chip, and much more complex games could be made. Rather than waiting for an entirely new generation of game hardware to be developed, you could just upgrade the cartridge to allow for more powerful games. As kids, we just knew that Nintendo games kept getting better, often thanks to these MMC chips. Games kept getting better looking graphics and got more complex with more advanced game styles. In Japan, Nintendo switched from selling games on cartridge to selling games on magnetic floppy disk using the Famicom Disk System. They were cheaper to make, and player game data could be saved to disk. We never got the disk system in America, but the more complex games that they empowered were brought to the US with memory mapper chips and a cartridge design that would allow player progress to be kept alive with a tiny amount of RAM powered by a battery. In America, Nintendo made all the NES cartridges. NES developers had to choose which memory mapper chip hardware their NES games would be based on from Nintendo's pre-made selection of mapper chips. This is in stark contrast to the Japanese game market, where third-party developers could manufacture their own cartridges and include their own hardware to put inside them. The Nintendo Famicom games that were developed with proprietary mapper chips would need to be reprogrammed to take advantage of the common Nintendo hardware if they wanted to bring their game out overseas. Some games, like Castlevania 3, were reprogrammed and downgraded, while some games, like Gradius 2, had their localization passed up entirely. That's where the FPGA Magic in Everdrives comes in handy. FPGA-based Everdrive are modern solutions to a 1980s problem. The goal is to play existing games on original console hardware, but not have original cartridges. FPGA stands for Field Programmable Gate Arrays, and it allows for logic circuits to recreate an existing chipset from within the cartridge hardware. Not only would you be able to access a ROM image of the game located on an SD card, but the FPGA chip on the cartridge would be configured to recreate the memory mapper hardware on a per-game basis. Think of FPGA as digital clay. The Everdrives shapes it to perfectly mimic the original game cartridge's chips, including these complex mappers. This synergy between hardware and software is recreated in FPGA. This allows an Everdrive to run almost every single game for Master System, NES, Famicom, and Famicom Disk System platforms. So, as a retro game fan, you have a choice. Do you buy one cartridge of an increasingly expensive, super rare game? Or do you invest in an Everdrive, which would allow you to play almost every single game on original hardware with rock-solid reliability, and in some cases, better reliability than actual hardware? But what about piracy? Well, Nintendo and Sega are not making any new cartridges, and the game developers do not get a cut of used game sales. On the NES and Famicom platforms, there are a total of 2,626 total games. The Everdrive N8 supports 2,587 games, or a 98.5 compatibility rate. It runs them all but a handful of Famicom games with extremely obscure memory mappers or weird hardware tricks in a handful of games. Everdrives also allow you to create a memory save state using original hardware. It is incredibly powerful, and you can use it to add save support to games that did not support it originally, or to create your own checkpoints when you're playing against various bosses. It is incredibly convenient to not have to jot down passwords. This really helps when you're making a retro-themed YouTube channel quite a bit. So I mentioned Sega 8-bit hardware. The Everdrive for the Master System not only allows you to play all domestic games, all games from a different region, but even SG-1000 games. The SG-1000 was the Japanese-only precursor to the Sega Master System. Say you want to play some crazy expensive obscure games on original Sega hardware, you can do that. A Sega power-based converter plugged into the Genesis cannot play SG-1000 games or use save states, but a power-based converter can't do SG-1000 games anyway on original cartridges or Sega cards. Since the Master System has a pause button on the console, it can be a little inconvenient to get up and hit it. So the in-game menu can actually work as an unofficial pause button. Pretty sweet. On the power-based converter, games with battery saves will have the save functionality work, but not save states. So you'll want to get an original Sega Master System to make the most of your Sega Everdrive. With an Everdrive, you can enjoy the Famicom Disk System software on original Nintendo hardware without having to actually deal with the increasingly fragile and unpredictable actual Famicom Disk System hardware. The NES could not take advantage of the expanded audio of the Famicom Disk System in some games. However, if you play on a retro USB AVS or import a Famicom or an AV Famicom, you can take advantage of all the sound channels that the disk system has, and you can play Akumaju Densetsu or Gimmick the way that it was originally intended. Oh, do you want to hear the sound processor that Gimmick had and you don't have over 1,400 to shell out for an original Famicom cartridge? Well, you can run it on the Everdrive like it's no big deal. Everdrives are designed to work with original hardware, but they do work with some clone systems, but you're going to run into some issues. The cartridge games work on the Retron line of the Hyperkin clone systems, but the save states and the Famicom Disk System games do not work. Games that save to a cartridge via SRAM and battery work just fine. The Retron 5 console that plays all cartridge games via software emulation does not work at all. But if you want to use your Everdrive on original Sega or Nintendo hardware, it works great. You can enjoy fan translations of games that never came out in your region, modified ROM hacks to re-enable certain cut content, more accurate translations, or patches that basically entirely remix a game. And you can enjoy independently produced modern NES and Sega games and play them on original hardware. The Master Everdrive X7 was $134, and the Everdrive N8 was $117, and the Everdrive N8 Famicom was $95. So originally, I got the Everdrive N8 Fami, which has 60 pins, and that was my first Everdrive. And then later on, I got a regular Everdrive N8, which is 72 pins. And they're currently selling the Everdrive N8 Pro. The N8 Pro supports multiple save states per game, but the regular one only supports one. The original N8 has a couple seconds of loading per game, while the N8 Pro has instant loading. I really like the retro stylings of the N8 Fami that has the katakana text and pulse wave design. Aesthetics count for something when it comes to retro games. It's not just being able to play almost every single game, but you actually get to play the software from 2 additional import game systems, the Nintendo Famicom Disk System and the Sega SG-1000. So Everdrives are not cheap, but they are totally worth the investment. So I thought I would save some money by ordering a bootleg Sega Everdrive on Amazon. It was horrible. It was slow, it took a hell of a lot longer to load games, and it frequently crashed, and then it was put into an unusable, unstable state. I returned it to Amazon and I used the money to buy a real Everdrive. For some people, it is an alternative to collecting cartridges, but for me, I think it's a great way to supplement my cartridge collecting habit, and it gives me a viable alternative for the really expensive games that I haven't found yet. With an Everdrive, your game library goes from a few expensive shelf trophies to basically the entire history of 8-bit Nintendo and Sega. For me, the older that I get, the more I love 8-bit gaming, and I'm really glad that there are high-quality products like this that give me the flexibility to play games that I never got a chance to. Hey, thank you very much for watching this video, and it would really help me out if you would subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Hitting that like button helps tell YouTube that you thought this video was pretty dope. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.